second panel. And we move to the third one and the last. This will examine the transparency and use of scientific studies in the glyphosate risk assessment in the European Union and try to discuss the implication of the Monsanto Papers for us. I'm pleased to introduce our two experts, Martin Pigeon, a researcher and campaigner on agribusiness issues from an NGO, Corporate Europe Observatory. He's also a member of the Citizens Committee behind the European Citizens Initiative Stop Glyphosate. And Dr. Tim Baumer, the chairman of the ECHA Committee for Risk Assessment. Of course, this is the committee concluding that this spring that on basis of the available information, it is not justified to classify glyphosate as carcinogenic. So both speakers very interesting. Of course, we start with Mr. Pigeon, 15 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks a lot to the Environment and Agriculture Committee for the invitation and the opportunity to present our work. I'm Martin Pigeon, I'm French, I'm working with Corporate Europe Observatory. I have been for the past 8 years now, and this is not working very well. Yes. As is customary on these matters, so we, as an organization, we study corporate lobbying and the possible influence that companies can have on EU policies. We work across a range of topics. I've been working on agribusiness, particularly because this is so important for industry, EFSA's independence and transparency policies for the past 5 years now. And this is why actually this whole glyphosate debate is so interesting for us, because for us, we very much see that as a magnifying glass. A lot of what we've heard this morning is not really news. We need EFSA, we need public safety agencies, but as we've heard as well, those are regulatory processes. That means these are defined by the laws, and the laws are sometimes not, influenced by the companies. And therefore, EFSA has to work with the tools that they have, and not all of them are consistent with the scientific practice. I'm also, as CEO, as a supporter of the Stop Glyphosate ECI, and I will get back to our demands in my conclusions. So, Monsanto is a very interesting company to be subject to a leak of internal documents like this, because science is a cornerstone of their public relations approach, and this is an example. Actually, specifically in their documents, they say, we advocate for supportive policies, regulation and laws that are based on the principles of sound science. Now, if you're a bit familiar with the issue, sound science is a word with a bit of a history. And actually, what is also interesting is that science in Monsanto's speak, and that goes actually beyond Monsanto, is used as a way to keep democracy at bay. And this is extremely clear in the response that they have done to this parliament. We have observed with increasing alarm the politicization of the EU procedure on the renewal of glyphosate, a procedure which should be strictly scientific. Go away, MEPs. This is also a very interesting presentation, position paper by the agribusiness industry in reaction to the Juncker's proposal to reform the comitology process. By all means, do not publish the member states' positions, because we want the process to be science-based. So this is a quote that's coming from the Monsanto Papers, and that I think is very highlighting and revealing about what sound science really means. Data generated by academics has always been a major concern for us in the defense of our products. Yes, we love science, but not academia so much. But this goes beyond Monsanto. This is a very interesting slide from the plastics lobby here in Brussels, which relates to the endocrine disruptors process. So, you know, it's this classical SWOT analysis. They have a problem. There is scientific evidence showing endocrine disrupting properties of plastic, but they have strength. They have the willingness and actually the money to fund further research and position themselves as a responsible industry. And because this is an opportunity as well, scientific research on the matter is complicated, and we can, it can also show different results on endocrine disruptors. So, science for political impact is a very popular sport, and Monsanto is not the only one doing it. Now, you've seen that already. Why is this going the wrong way? Oh, okay, reaching glyphosate. This is an interesting advertisement in Australia for the Roundup product, the ultimate killing machine. You can see why it is appealing to someone who wants to, weed his farm. Indeed, lobbying is a relationship, and all of that we've heard about Monsanto's manipulations of science wouldn't be very bad if we had a very robust and reliable system for the assessment of pesticides in the EU, and the problem is that we don't have such a system as we speak. There are very good elements in it, and we want to protect that, but there are also very big flaws, and those are I'm going to describe in the course of my presentation. Keeping in mind that 15 minutes is really, really short. First of all, let's start with the basics. EFSA does not have the financial and legal means of its mission. They don't have access to the samples of their products. They're only doing literature reviews. They're hardly commissioning any research themselves. They don't have hardly any budget to pay external experts. There was a reference made earlier to some research that we've produced showing that there is a very high rate of external experts with conflicts of interest. This is also linked to budgetary issues, and this is also the reflect of policy choices. We find €1.5 billion to give to the pharmaceutical industry. We only find €80 million to give to EFSA's annual budget. This could be changed. I didn't intend to go to this slide already, sorry. And as we've heard already, okay, this system is not working very well, I'm sorry. Yeah, and this was eloquently put by Professor Portier. One of the root of the problems that we have is that the raw data used by agencies is produced by industry and cannot be published. And so the EU agencies have to rely on them, and that explains a lot of the copy-paste scandals that we've discussed earlier. And so this is what Professor Tarazona, was describing in. Guys, how is this working? So this is how the BfR describes how it dealt with industry's application. Indeed, they do say that they were not able to report the original studies in detail due to the large number of submitted toxicological studies. Indeed, the original dossier provided by industry was enormous. And so instead what they've done is that simply they've taken the industry's dossier and they've edited it. And that became ultimately, the EU official assessment. And it's meant to be transparent. The BfR is meant to write in italics in the dossier, except that, and I'm sorry to disagree with you here, they haven't done it very consistently, and sometimes they haven't done it at all. And so here they describe that they've done it only for the study descriptions and assessments, but this is not the whole story. First of all, they haven't done it for could I please have my next slide? Thank you. So these are examples, and you cannot read them, of course, I'm sorry, of general conclusions of chapters, not individual study assessments. And this is really bad because those chapters were meant to evaluate the independent scientific literature, not the secret studies, that form the backbone of industry applications. In this case, you're talking about what the outside world is saying about glyphosate. And here, there's not a single word of difference between the GTF's, so industry's evaluation of the genotoxicity, the carcinogenicity and the epidemiology on glyphosate, and what EFSA has been producing based on what the BfR produced. And again, it's an absolute scandal that the BfR as a public agency is not here today. So the response indeed to the copy-paste scandal by the European Commission and agencies has been, well, it's not a scandal because that's what we do all the time. I don't find this very reassuring. And as I've shown, it was not always what has been done. Again, what the BfR described as its methodology was not consistently applied. Some of the individual evaluations of studies hadn't anything written in italic or in yellow, for the sake of it, written. So I've talked that, let's go back. So the first major problem we have in the EU is that agencies don't have enough resources. They don't have also they have very strong legal constraints. And this is a lot of what we've done at CEO, is to try to access the confidential industry studies submitted by to the agencies. It's taken a lot of time. It's taken a year and really exceptional political circumstances for this data to be released. And actually, you need to grant EFSA some courage here, because they really faced a lot of political pushback and lobbying by industry. A lot of letters, such as this one, opposing the disclosure of this data, but nevertheless, they went all the way and they published as much as they could. So this is the decision in September 2016. So they released as much as they could. And that's already a lot. So you have to give that to them. But they cannot go against the law either. And them releasing the totality of the dossier would have exposed them, presumably, to lawsuits by Monsanto. And that's the reason why substantial sections of the data have been redacted. And also the data that we received was image PDFs, which is very difficult to analyze. So of course at CEO, we are not toxicologists. There's only so much we can understand about the nature of the discussion. So we can have an advice on the process, and that's the bulk of my presentation. But so we forwarded all the data that we had received to competent scientists, and Mr. Portier was one of them. And that formed eventually the data that he used for his ultimate evaluation. So thanks to data EFSA has released, there was ultimately a serious peer review on what has been done by EFSA. So that's good. Again, it's taken a lot of time, energy, colossal resources. This is really not a functional process. This shouldn't be the norm. And as Mr. Portier said earlier on, Dr. Portier, sorry, I heard this was an insult. It looks like by the peer review provided by on this evidence, a lot of the original findings were missing. And so that would indicate that the agencies, BfR and agency, certainly looked at the application, but they didn't look at the raw data before there was some serious criticism brought to them by IARC and then subsequently. And that is quite consistent with actually what the BfR themselves wrote. Due to the enormous amount of the submission, we basically didn't write our own report. We just edited the one that the summaries and conclusions that industry provided. The third elephant in the room, as far as the weakness of the EU safety assessment of pesticide, is that indeed, as has been mentioned already, only the active substance, in this case glyphosate, is evaluated. But glyphosate is never used alone in the real world. Farmers are applying Roundup or other formulations of herbicide, glyphosate-containing herbicides. Jesus. So another problem is that a lot of the independent literature tries to deal with real-world conditions. And this is actually an argument used by industry to dismiss this literature because, it doesn't apply to glyphosate. These are confounding factors. And this approach has been also, because this is the regulation, followed by EFSA and the other EU regulators. And this is actually confirmed by Monsanto themselves. This is an internal email by Donna Farmer that puts it very eloquently. You cannot say that Roundup is not a carcinogen simply because we have not done the necessary testing on the formulation to make that statement. The testing of the formulations are not anywhere near the level of the active ingredient. And again, this is EU regulation as we know it, described by the BfR in its list of the studies that he requires. So you're talking about acute toxicity, irritation of skin and the eyes, dermal absorption, and that's it. Nothing long-term, nothing about cancer. So I'm skipping this. In terms of independence, as we've heard, the external experts are not involved in EFSA's peer review, so-called peer review, but national experts are. But the problem is that some of these national experts, first of all, they're anonymous. Most of them refused to have their identity disclosed. But I mean, given the sensitivity of the file, I can understand why. But that also means that some of them are also representing the government's positions, and so there are actually few guarantees against risks of political interference in this process. So we've heard about the Judge Rowland's case. That's a long story to tell, but perhaps it's important for you to hear it. Judge Rowland is this expert at the EPA who's been shown in the Monsanto Papers as having collusions with Monsanto, and he's actually, because agencies tend to collaborate among themselves all the time, which actually might have some link with the fact that they all agree, actually. Almost all of them agree. And so Mr. Rowland actually participated to a press conference, to a teleconference organized in the framework of EFSA's peer review, and provided basically information that confirmed EFSA in its decision to discard a very important study. We asked to EFSA to provide evidence that they had double-checked what this guy has said, and they didn't have anything to show. So the last elephant in the room, and that's a very important one, in the form of a paper published in Science actually 2 weeks ago, is that, again, the real use conditions of herbicides are nowhere assessed. And so, for example, this is how glyphosate can be used, how Roundup can be used in the real world. This is a green desert, so-called green desert in Argentina, of Roundup-tolerant soy. This is a monocropping over kilometers. It's the most destructive form of agriculture ever invented for biodiversity in rural communities. This is nowhere in the EU's environmental assessment scope, because that's not what they have to look at. When you douse an entire landscape, that's not assessed. So please remind that there are also very good elements in the EU pesticides regulation. This is the 8 paragraphs that the pesticides industry probably hates the most. Those are the famous cutoff criteria, and that's actually the reason why IARC's assessment was so dangerous for Monsanto and the other glyphosate producers, because a 2A rating in IARC more or less translates into a 1B rating in the EU system, and that, according to the EU regulation, imposes a ban, and I'm concluding immediately. I'm concluding with, the demands of the Stop Glyphosate initiative, but I would like really to conclude with a political question. What do we do about farmers? Because if we are to believe the science, they are right now in an impossible dilemma. Either they keep using Roundup and other herbicides like that and they risk cancer, or they stop using it and they're facing economic losses. Why should they face the competition of non-EU farmers using farming practices that are a disaster? This is a dilemma they cannot get out of alone, and this is the reason why in the European Citizens Initiative we are also asking for support measures accompanying a ban of glyphosate, trade measures and technical measures as well. And I'll conclude this. Sorry for being too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, the next speaker.